We're thrilled to have with us this evening author Clyde Ford. Ford was an instructor at Western Washington University, where he taught the introduction to the African American experience. His books include We Can All Get Along, 50 Steps You Can Take to Help End Racism, and The Long Mile, for which he received the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award. Ford is currently an opinion columnist with the regional online magazine Crosscut. Please join me in welcoming Clyde Ford.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you to all of you who are joining. It's always a pleasure to be back speaking to Whatcom County Libraries, the Bellingham Libraries, and my good friends there. You know, I can't say enough about this community in terms of its support for authors. And it's certainly been for me over the last, almost 30 years now that I've been writing and had the opportunity to present that writing here in Bellingham. So we are going to be talking about technology and social justice tonight. And this presentation really comes directly from my latest book that's been published, and that is Think Black. Ostensibly, Think Black is a memoir about my father, John Stanley Ford, who was the first Black software engineer in America. And at a deeper level, it's really a book about the role of technology in social justice, human rights, and race. And so what I'd like to do, well, I'm not sure I'd like to do this because I actually shrink myself by doing it. But what I want to do is to share my screen with you, which means I'll get shrunk to a little postage size stamp somewhere in the upper right, maybe, of your screen, but you'll at least be able to hear me as I talk through some of the aspects of the slide presentation that I think are really appropriate for this. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And since I can see it and everything is switched right here, I'm going to assume that everyone on your end can see it as well too. And the first thing I really would like to do is just to make sure that you understand that this is an educational presentation for Whatcom Reads, for the libraries involved, and that the views expressed are mine. They don't necessarily reflect the beliefs, the views, or the policies of WCLS or any of the participating libraries or any of the sponsors as well too. What I'd like to do tonight is really give you a sense of the history of human rights and social justice in high technology through the lens of looking at my father's experience and my experience working with IBM as well too. I want to talk about what the implications of that history are. I definitely want to talk about what the current relationship between high-tech human rights and social justice is. And I also want to say a couple of things about what each of us can do that might make a difference as well too. After that, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. And as you heard, this presentation is going to be recorded, so you will have the opportunity to consult it at another point. And the other thing I'll make sure that I do is to give you or at least to give the library the slides that I've used for this presentation, so you can also have access to them by contacting someone at the library system, and they'll be able to get them to you. So I also want to say before we go on that there are a couple of places in this presentation where I do have some imagery that may be a little disturbing to some people. I'm not including that imagery for its shock value at all. I am including it for its educational value. But if in looking at this imagery, it in any way triggers any overwhelming thoughts, feelings, emotions, please, I'm going to invite you to take care of yourself in whatever way you see fit during or after this presentation. Whether that means getting up from your computer screen or however you're watching the presentation, whether it means turning off the video, but perhaps listening to the audio, or whether it means finding somebody to talk to about that imagery tonight, after the presentation, or even at some later date. I'm just going to assume that you're going to do that in a way that's most appropriate for you. I thought that a really great place to start this presentation would be to contrast my first day at IBM with my dad's first day at IBM. And a great place to begin to read from my book about my first day at IBM would really be to connect it with some music that I think is very appropriate to the time. We're talking about IBM when I joined in 1971, and this was one of the pieces of music at that time. And that, as you know, is a theme song from the film Shaft. I held fast to an overhead bar as the elevated train I rode in swayed from side to side, rocketing into Manhattan from the Bronx. When it dove beneath the Harlem River, everything outside of the car went dark, and I caught a reflection of myself in the mirror. A ballooned afro, pork chop sideburns, a blue zoot suit with red pinstripes, a fire engine red turtleneck, and a trench coat with its collar turned up. On that fall day in 1971, I was young and black, defiant and angry, and more than ever determined not to be like my father. Yet there I stood, about to report for work at IBM, where my dad had worked for 25 years. So there I am at my first day at work in 1971. Here's a picture of my dad with his IBM colleagues not long after he went to work. He was hired by IBM in 1946, went to work in 1947, January. This is a picture from the early 1950s, somewhere 1950, 51, my dad with his IBM colleagues in New York City. I'm going to describe my dad's first day at work, but just like with mine, there's a selection of music that was appropriate for then. And those are the first two bars of Duke Ellington's A Train, because it was the late 1940s, post-World War II America. Anything was possible. Duke Ellington swung jazz, Jackie Robinson swung a big league bat, Brown versus Board of Education swung through the courts. Yet nowhere were new possibilities and promises felt more deeply than in Harlem, which was then Black America's gravitational center. In a City College classroom on the edge of Harlem, an accounting professor invited one of her students to dinner. That Black GI arrived at her swanky apartment dressed to the nines. And Thomas J. Watson Sr., founder of IBM, stepped from the shadows. Watson offered my father a job, and a Branch Rickey Jackie Robinson moment ensued. The start of an unknown chapter in the history of modern day computers. Now, a lot of times I'm talking to younger audiences about this, and again, I don't know the age of everybody in front of me, but I do know when I'm talking to high schools and even middle schools about this, a lot of times I'll say Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson, and there are blank stares on folks in the audience. So I just want to remind ourselves who Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson were, why that was an important moment in African-American history, and why I also looked at this as being a metaphor of how my father's experience at IBM could be told. And there's Branch Rickey on the right. He was the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. There's Jackie Robinson on the left. He was the first Black baseball player to step to the plate in a Major League Baseball game in 1947. He was hired by the Dodgers in 1945, spent a year and a half, 2 seasons actually in their farm league. And so in 1947, the same year my dad came to work for IBM, Jackie Robinson came to the plate at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn in New York City. And it seemed to me this was really going to be a great metaphor, a great way to talk about my dad as the first African-American in high tech and computers, and Jackie Robinson then as the first baseball player in Major League Baseball. At least that's what I thought. Some of you may actually have seen the film 42, which was Jackie Robinson's number. In the film, Chadwick Boseman was playing, the late Chadwick Boseman was playing a young Jackie Robinson. And there's actually a picture in front of you of Jackie Robinson stepping up to the plate. I believe that's actually at Ebbets Field. So I thought, my dad's kind of in the role of Jackie Robinson, but in high tech. And Thomas J. Watson then would be in the role of Branch Rickey, the manager of the Dodgers. Well, I delivered my manuscript. It wasn't finished. I actually delivered about a third of it to HarperCollins, my wonderful editor there, Tracy Sherrod at Amistad Press, the African-American imprint of HarperCollins. And we had lunch in New York City about a year before the book actually came out. Tracy said to me, I like what you've written, Clyde, but one of the things I don't know, one of the things I think everybody's going to want to know is, who is this guy, Thomas Watson? Why did he hire your dad in 1946, just after the war? And what was his history that would bring him to this point of hiring your dad? I looked at Tracy and I said, Tracy, I don't have an answer right now to that question, but I promise you this. By the time I deliver the entire manuscript to you, I will know who Watson was. I will know why he hired my dad. And I'll know a little bit about the history of IBM leading up to that point in time. Sometimes, as I know you all know, be careful what you say you will do, what you ask for. By telling Tracy or promising her that, I actually started myself on a journey that I had no clue in beginning to write this book that I would take. But to understand my journey, let's take a moment and understand the timeline or the journey of technology in the last 120 years. So I've laid out a timeline from 1900 to 2020, and I think that's a really good timeline within which to understand where we are technologically. So as I'm doing this, I think one of the things I might ask you to do is, if your cell phone is close by or near, look at it, touch it, or hold it, because it's a great way to contrast the history that I'm going to talk about with the technology that you can hold in your hands. So a great place to start with that history is 1900, and a really good place to start in 1900 is with the actual digital machines that computed the US Census. So this is the actual machine. It's called a Hollerith card punch reading machine. And this is an actual copy of the machine. This is not a copy, this is an actual image of the machine that computed the census in 1900. And these were actually punched, the data for census data was punched into punch cards. Those punch cards were read by machines that looked just like this, but hundreds, if not thousands of them. And as you can see, the data that was tabulated within those punch cards were actually then calculated or computed rather on those dials. And so there's actually operators in front of these dials reading from the punch cards, a very interesting way that digital technology was first brought to bear. And I say it's digital. When I say digital, what I'm talking about here actually is you have a 1 or a 0, something's there or something's not there. On a punch card, a column is either punched or it's not. So you have one piece of information there. It's either there, it's a 0, or it's a 1. So that's what we're talking about in terms of digital technology. Obviously, rather inefficient in terms of what we have today. But let me tell you that the cell phone you're holding in your hand or looking at traces its history directly back to the machine in this wooden frame that looks like a piece of furniture or a desk that you're looking at on the left side of your screen. Hey, the next place maybe to stop in this digital timeline is just before the 1930s, 1928, one of IBM's first machines, an IBM 301. The only difference really between the 301 and the machine that was used to compute the census is that instead of an operator, in the middle of that piece of furniture was a converted typewriter. And so you did not need operators to read the dials. The machine itself typed out or printed out the sum of the tabulations that took place on those cards. Again, that's this machine that read what, maybe 100 cards a minute, did very rudimentary computations like additions and some basic statistics like averages, things of that nature. But it was a powerful addition in the history of digital computers. I want you to remember that 301 because that image is going to be important in the rest of our discussion. So the next machine in this timeline would be an IBM 407, introduced a couple of years after my dad went to work for IBM. The important thing about a IBM 407 is that it was the first programmable, commercially available computer. What that means is, and let me very briefly describe what you're looking at. On the left side, you've got a card hopper that reads cards and reads data from these cards. No such thing as software in those days, nothing that you would remotely identify as software in terms of its modern context. All you had on those cards were numbers and other kinds of data, like a person's name, for example. In the middle, very similar to the IBM 301, at the bottom of your screen, you had a converted typewriter that printed out or typed out the data that was computed from those cards. And at the very right end, there's a drawer with a handle. You can see the handle. You pulled that open. You pulled out a board which looked very much like a telephone board, where you then patched together one hole of a board with another. By putting a patch cord between two holes, you internally connected the circuits of this machine. And by making those connections internally, you caused the machine to compute, to add, it could do rudimentary subtractions, and also print out various data. Important in this sense. Now, let me make the contrast then to show you how far we've come and talk about its importance in that way. As the first programmable computer, because you could then actually control what circuits were talking to each other, the IBM 407 then weighed on the order of, well, let's contrast it to your cell phone, which weighed somewhere between 4 to maybe 8 ounces. The IBM 407 weighed 3 tons, a little bit heavier than you might want to put into your pocket, and a fully fleshed out control room that had the IBM 407 and all the tape drives and other equipment that might be associated with it could weigh up to 12 tons. And it was actually cooled then with specialized water pipes and other things. You can imagine how you might build out a room like that, when in fact you have in your hands right now a device which is, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100 million times, if not a billion times, more powerful than that IBM 407. For example, your cell phone might have what, maybe 64, 128, 256 gigabytes, maybe even a terabyte of storage memory inside of it. The IBM 407 had that much memory inside of it. Memory and the concepts that we know about today had not really been thought about. Now I'm making a hop, skip, and a jump, and there are a number of computers that fall in between the 407 and the 360, but the 360 was an important step in the process of this digital technology that we want to understand as we also overlay on top of that social justice and human rights issues. 360 introduced in 1960, followed very quickly by a 370 series, very similar to that. Those were the computers that I first went to work on, although I have to say my dad brought home for us, my sister and myself, early 407 control boards to work with. So I actually began programming computers. Ooh, I don't know what happened here. I do know. I somehow got, oh, there I am. I'm back to where I need to be. Good. Okay. So after, I was just going to say, we programmed 407s using the control boards under the direction of our father early on. So again, late 70s, early 80s, you're starting to get computers that look a little more like what we are familiar with today, what you're probably watching this presentation on your desktop, Apples and IBMs. 1991, really not that long ago, just 30 years ago, is when the internet came into existence. Along with the internet, you got these extensive, huge server farms. Just to throw it in because I thought it was interesting to note, a very important moment in the history, which will probably be looked back on as a very important moment. It was the first quantum computing, actually 1998, again, not that long ago. Not going to go into talking about that difference very deeply, other than to say quantum computing, very different from digital computing. In digital computing, you know something is a 1 and a 0 because it's either punched there or it's not punched there, it's present or it's not. Quantum computing, the best way to think about it is you don't know whether something is punched into a card until you actually examine the card. You don't know whether something's a 1 and a 0 until you actually look at it. Wow, it introduces a whole different way of computing, which is a lot of fun. But again, that's not really what we want to talk about. The last thing we just want to mention is where in this timeline your cell phone falls in, and that's really pretty late in the process, 2007. So look at the entire range of technology and you get a sense of the sweep of digital technology. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but within that, we want to talk about where this intersects with social justice and human rights. So the first place it intersects is with eugenics. Hard to believe, but we have a picture there of Madison Grant. In 1916, Madison Grant wrote a book, The Passing of the Great Race. And believe me, the great race he was talking about, even though it's a mythical race, was the race that eugenics was talking about. And that is what they often called the Nordic stock. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned individuals who they, and Madison Grant in particular, discussed as being the carriers of Western civilization. Although it'd be great if we could banish Madison Grant's book to the relics of history. 2016, that book was reprinted in a 100th anniversary edition. During the last administration, the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, who was Trump's czar of immigration and his immigration advisor, cited that book as the basis for the immigration policies of this country. So I just want to say, and I think it's important to note that eugenics and someone like Madison Grant, not in the past, but actually very much present with us today. Another figure, Charles Davenport, president of the the Eugenics Record Association and the Eugenics Record Organization, or I should say director of those two organizations, out of a laboratory on Long Island, just out of New York City, Cold Springs Harbor. But the important thing to note about eugenics also is that it really attracted some of the rich and famous of the 1900s. It attracted the Roosevelts and the Rockefellers and the Kellogg's. But it also attracted individuals like Alexander Graham Bell, who was president of the board of the Eugenics Record Association. And it attracted individuals as important to women's health as Margaret Zenger, who viewed the work that she did, in her words, viewed the birth control work she was doing as, quote, culling the weeds, and that's her phrase, of humanity in support of the eugenics ideal. So eugenics was really, I think, both bizarre in its being a pseudoscience of race, but also being really important in this country in the early 1900s. 1926, Davenport got funded to do a study on the island of Jamaica, a study of mixed-race individuals. The idea was if he could identify who was mixed race, meaning who was either with parentage both from European side and either African or indigenous Jamaican side, then that would be really helpful because those would be the individuals that the eugenics organizations would attempt to make sure they did not reproduce. I know this sounds horrible, but this is the truth of this study. You can look it up on the internet. It's called the Jamaica Study. That's what their goal was, to identify who was pure European, who was pure African or pure native Jamaican, and who was mixed race, and to make sure that pure Africans and those who were mixed race didn't reproduce so that those who were pure Europeans could. The problem was that there were so many millions of people on the island of Jamaica that Davenport did not have enough scribes to literally write down the census data that they were collecting. 1924, 4 companies were bought together as a single company. And in 1924, the person who was responsible, the president of that new entity, changed the name of those companies, the name of that entity from CTR to IBM. And Watson then didn't have to travel very far to get to Cold Springs Harbor on Long Island and say to Davenport, Charles Davenport, you don't know how to go about this study because you can't collect the data, but we have the technology that can collect that data. You remember from the timeline, the IBM 301s. And so those were the machines then and the punch cards that were used first to format how the data would be collected and stored. And IBM engineers worked with the Eugenics Record Organization to create the format for collecting the data on punch cards that were then read, processed, and stored at IBM's design. And the IBM 301 was the equipment that was used to do that. That study, because of IBM's support, was incredibly successful in the eugenicists' eyes. They were pleased to announce the success of the Jamaica study. And they were then in the process in the early 1930s of attempting to replicate that study worldwide. Now, 1933, those attempts were interrupted because of a major use of this idea that the eugenicists had started in 1933. I don't have to tell you, the focus would be on Nazi Germany. And so 5 years after they actually engaged with the eugenicists here in the United States, IBM and Watson took what they were doing with high tech and placed it in the service of Hitler and the Third Reich. Now, look, I could spend the entire evening talking about IBM's involvement with the Holocaust. Let me just read a short selection from my book that might help situate this for us. And then again, this is from Think Black. IBM machines identified and counted Jews, traced back their ancestry for generations, marked them for transport to concentration camps, managed the railroads that transported them there, kept track of which Jews were killed and which remained alive, identified which Jews possessed what skills, and helped the Nazis allocate them for slave labor, maintained records on the health and fitness of Jews for barbaric medical experiments or being worked to death, kept records of the torture and execution of Jews in all concentration camps, kept track of all German soldiers, planned German tank and troop movements against the Allies, and even scheduled Luftwaffe bombing runs. IBM supplied and trained Nazi operators on their equipment. IBM authorized German subsidiaries to manufacture equipment and spare parts, and IBM kept all their equipment in the Third Reich in good working order. All business with Hitler's Germany took place at market rates that afforded IBM fantastical profits. Now, these weren't machines that IBM leased to Hitler, or excuse me, that sold to Hitler, and therefore could claim plausible deniability. Well, he bought them, but I don't know what happened to them. IBM didn't lease machines in those days, didn't even lease machines in the day my father was hired or when I was hired, sell machines. IBM only leased machines. And so let me be clear on that again. IBM didn't sell machines to Nazi Germany. They leased those machines, and they leased them so that they could control those machines. They pledged and they signed contracts and agreements to keep those machines in good working order. IBM engineers, using the same very similar format to what they used in the Jamaica study, then worked with Nazi Third Reich engineers to design punch card formats for collecting the data that they did collect on German citizens that would help them identify who was Jewish and who was not. I'm sure some of you have seen movies of the Third Reich or during the Second World War, and they have individuals in concentration camps. Often you'll see tattooed on their lower forearm a number, and those numbers were very frequently associated with a punch card, a set of punch cards that were kept in special rooms in each concentration camp. So at the left of your screen, you'll see an actual punch card that was used by the Third Reich to collect that kind of information. And I just want to say again, IBM was involved at every stage of this. You can go online, and actually find Hitler pinning on Watson's chest in 1937 a special medal for IBM and Watson's assistance. And this was a medal designed specifically for Watson, given to him by Hitler for his assistance in helping the Third Reich proceed and be successful in its program to literally to exterminate the Jewish population. I have to say, when I was researching this part of the book, I woke up alternately wanting to throw up and cry, realizing that this was one of the big uses of technology in the early 1930s, going throughout the entire World War. So the war comes to an end, but technology doesn't. And one only needs to look around the world at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the Third Reich, to see that a place with very similar aims and potentially very similar uses of technology is the apartheid regime in South Africa. And that is where IBM and Watson then next took this technology. Starting in the 1950s, IBM machines were delivered to the South African regime. And please remember, the South African regime had goals very, very similar to those of the Jamaica study. In South Africa, the idea was you want to be able to determine who in your population is Black, who is colored, and who is white. And that's not much different between who's European, who's pure African or Jamaican, and who's mixed race. In fact, not only is it similar, but IBM at this point has now more than 20 years experience using machines that look very much like the IBM 301 and the 407 that I showed you before in doing this. And these are the machines then that are brought in the early parts of South Africa. Again, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about IBM's role in apartheid. Let me just say this. I think it'll give you a good sense of what I'm talking about here. In South Africa, there were two kinds of passbooks that were used to identify the population. One passbook was called the Book of Life, and it was distributed to white South Africans and colored South Africans. And another passbook was called the National Identification Pass or the National Identification Card. And it was used and given to Black South Africans who were then herded into reservation-like areas called Bantustans. IBM designed special printing equipment, special printers, that would print both the National Identification Pass used for Black South Africans and the Book of Life used for white and colored South Africans. But not only did IBM printers print those passbooks, IBM maintained the data now at the late 1950s, going into the 1960s, not just on punch cards, but on sophisticated tape drives, disk devices, using database formats. And so as the technology evolved, its use in helping a regime like the South African regime be even more creative in how they pursued this very divisive, very violent oppression of one part of their population, IBM was there to support that. So again, I said we would do this earlier. Let's just take this timeline that we talked about before and summarize where we've been with this. We've got eugenics, we've got the Holocaust, we've got apartheid, and now I think, as you'll see in a moment, the technology, the ideas don't stop, even as apartheid ends, but we get into a modern era, the era that we're familiar with, and the same technology then is used to pursue things like facial recognition technology. So in 2005, IBM working with New York City Police Department in a project that's within the New York City Police Department called the Lower Manhattan Security Initiative, or LMSI, which is a room in Lower Manhattan, a huge room with all the lettered agencies having seats at the table, and the thousands of video cameras from CCD cameras all over New York City feeds into this room. And no, unlike TV programs, there is no one or two or three or even 10 people watching all these cameras. There is computer equipment monitoring all the camera feeds. IBM, without the approval or even knowledge of New Yorkers in 2005, was actually using the video footage from these CCTV cameras to train their facial recognition technology in order to better discriminate based on skin color. Now, I have to say, there is then a direct line between the use of that technology in the 1930s to discriminate based on skin color with very rudimentary digital technology to its use in 2005. The technology then now much more sophisticated, but the aims exactly the same. I also want to be very clear and fair in that in 2020, IBM actually hired a new CEO, a fellow named Arvind Krishna, who I've had the pleasure to sit down and speak with. And one of the first things Arvind Krishna did was to pull IBM back from research, sales, and development of facial recognition technology. I applaud him for that. I think it's a great thing that happened. I think it needed to be done because facial recognition technology was so discriminatory. IBM, being the first to do that, actually forced some other large competitors like Microsoft and Amazon to do something similar. And I say something similar only to say this. I mean, IBM actually made a statement that they weren't going to do this. Amazon was a little bit more equivocal and said, yeah, we'll pull out of this for a year. And that year that they said they were going to pull out of is coming up very quickly. And their shareholders have attempted to say to them, look, we want to make sure you don't get back into this business. And Amazon has actually attempted to make an end run around its shareholders and not allow a vote on that very issue to come up at their next shareholder meeting. Again, just a short plug for Crosscut. If you want to read more about Amazon's involvement, I have a recent Crosscut column that appeared that talks in more detail about some of the machinations that a company like Amazon is even going through today with regard to this technology. I'll also say that just because the big three pulled out of this technology, it left a huge hole for lots of smaller companies like Clearview to step into. And so this technology is still being deployed, being used by United States agencies like ICE and CBP at our borders to determine who comes into the country, who doesn't come into the country. Although some cities like Portland, like Cambridge, and I think San Francisco now as well too, have said we do not want law enforcement using facial recognition technology within our city limits. So very important to understand the history of where facial recognition technology comes in when you look at this very long and very unfortunate role of technology in social justice and human rights. I want to go back to really recent history. How about January 6th? And look at the role of social media. And there would be no social media without that long history that we talked about in terms of technology. But I want to look at social media and its role in being able to incite, helping people organize, and even execute rather severe attacks against our democracy. And so when I looked at January 6th and the events that took place there, what I saw was not just this bizarre group of characters who are now invading the halls of the United States Congress, but I also saw the technology without which that would not have been possible. And so, for example, yes, I saw that there were mainly white men and white women there. And unfortunately, there were some Capitol Police and even members of the military who were involved in that. More and more as we go on understanding what took place, we realize the extent to which people with whom we entrusted the safety of our legislators were sometimes on the wrong side of that issue. There were racist and white supremacist symbols all over the place. And really sadly, I think religious symbols like the cross, the Proud Boys, you might remember, actually kneeled and had a prayer service in front of a cross before they went on to attack the Capitol. Technology, though, behind all of this, unlike the protests that we saw over the summers, there were no tanks or military equipment used to try to thwart the demonstrators. I actually heard this morning the head of the DC Capitol Police saying, when he attempted to get the Pentagon to deploy troops to stop the protesters, the Pentagon, at least in his saying, were more concerned about the optics which I find really bizarre because the optics actually became, I think, even worse in terms of democracy. Again, the technology behind this to help this actually take place. Unlike the summer, there were no rubber bullets fired at protesters who were attempting to take over the Capitol. There were no megaphone warnings telling them to stay out. And so there were no unmanned federal officers like they were just south of us in Portland, who were there supporting local police and thwarting the movements of protesters. Bottom line, for me at least, there were no equivalents between what we saw on January 6th and the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer. And more importantly, I think we need to understand and appreciate the role of technology in helping all this happen. Yes, social media platforms like Parler were taken down from Amazon, but they were taken down in a move that, in my estimation, was too little, too late. They were taken down after the fact, when some of us have been calling for organizations and platforms and social media companies like Amazon and Twitter and Facebook to begin this process years ago. Just to remind you again, what technology then delivers for us is ways to incite, ways to organize, and ways to execute these kinds of plans. If you look to the left of your screen, you'll see this fellow's holding in his hands a cell phone. And that, you'll know, is really a computer that allows us to organize in the same way that computers, digital devices starting in the early 1900s, allowed eugenics study to take place, allowed Nazi Germany and apartheid right down the line. So, didn't happen during the Civil War. It took until 2021 for a Confederate flag, that racist symbol, to be flown inside the Capitol. Same thing with this noose. And again, sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office with a stun gun on his left hip, but in his right hand is a cell phone, is technology. So I think it's important to appreciate how unregulated technology, or technology that gets out of our hands, can be used really against us in these dramatic ways. And January 6th is a reminder of that. There's some other ways that I think we want to understand the role of technology in human rights. I can't think of a better way than pulse oximeters. Pulse oximeters, you might know, are those little devices, kind of like, pulse devices that might read your blood pressure, only these read actually blood oxygen levels by hooking onto the end of your finger. It's a really important tool used by the medical profession during this pandemic. The problem is that pulse oximeters don't read correctly for African Americans and others with dark skin. So now you get a technology that's supposed to be used to help people during a pandemic, unable to help the very people who are more subject to the ravages of that pandemic. Why? I don't think that engineers design these devices and say, hey, Joe, let's make a device that doesn't work for people of color. What I do think is that engineers are not trained to understand how what they do, unless they're very clear and conscious of it, tends to have bias built in. So if you build pulse oximeters and you only train them on, let's say, 100,000 people, and all those 100,000 people, or most of them, are white males between 25 and 40, guess who's going to have those pulse oximeters work really well for, and guess who's not going to have them work well for at all? And that's what I think you really have in the case of some of this technology. Wow, 2015. A Scandinavian company introduces a game called Slave Tetris. And this is a view from the screen of Slave Tetris. You walk an individual who is supposedly a slave up the side of a ship. You walk them off the ship, and as they are falling down into this slave ship, with your keyboard or your cell phone keys, you move that individual to the right or to the left to pack them as tight as you can. And that was supposed to be a really good educational game about slavery. I can't believe it. There are a lot of us whose mouths were just agape, realizing that a game like this would ever be taken seriously and a company would actually spend its development dollars making a game like this, yet it was made. Slave Tetris was made in 2015. And the problem, obviously, I mean, at least to me and to many people, obviously, is that if you treat slavery as a game, you minimize the historical importance and impact of slavery and the slave trade to African Americans. Why does this happen? Why does a company president actually try to defend this game? Because that company president and the people in that company who worked on this don't have a clue about the history of race and racism and slavery in the United States, and therefore they can design a game based on what they think without understanding the impact. They also don't have a clue in terms of how you present a product like this to a diverse focus group. I guarantee you, if the group that they presented this product to had people of color in that group, this product would never have gone out the door. And obviously, a company like that doesn't have a diverse corporate decision-making group, because again, if you had somebody in their C-suite who was a person of color, it's a good chance a game like this would not go on. It's not just a game, it's in the kind of machine learning, artificial intelligence that is becoming more and more important to us every day. Till 2016, Microsoft releases a Twitter bot developed in China called Tay. A Twitter bot is a software program that acts like a person, like a robot. That's why they call it a bot. It goes around the Twitterverse and interacts with other Twitter users. You can interact with it as though it's a person. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. It learns by interacting with other people. So that's the idea. What happened when IBM released Tay? Within 24 hours, Tay becomes this racist, vitriolic, anti-Semitic, misogynistic piece of software. You ask Tay about the Holocaust, and Tay says back to you, the Holocaust never happened, I hate Jews. You ask Tay about women, and Tay will say, women should go to hell. You ask Tay about DeRay McKesson, who was one of Black Lives Matter's strong activist, still is, and a founder. Tay said, DeRay McKesson should be hanged. Unbelievable. Fortunately, Microsoft pulled the program within 24 hours. And those phrases, by the way, were from the actual screenshots that you could have gotten if you interacted with Tay on Twitter. The problem, once again, is the developers in China were not educated on the history of race and racism in America. The other problem was, and this is one thing I have actually had the opportunity to talk directly to Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, and other divisions of Microsoft about, is that you need to build into machine learning and artificial intelligence checks that will prevent this. I'm actually sorry, to be honest, that Microsoft yanked the product and didn't release it again. I think they should have built into the product some of these more enlightened ideas so that the product stayed on Twitter. And if you interacted with Tay and you said, hey, you know, the Holocaust didn't exist, Tay would kind of throw a fit and say, are you crazy? Let me tell you about the Holocaust. And if you in any way suggested, you know, that women should go to hell, that Tay would say, you know, you're a misogynist. Let me tell you about the history and the contribution of women to this country and to our society. And if by any sense you said that DeRay McKesson ought to be hanged, then Tay would show you images from the lynchings, the 4,000 plus lynchings that took place in the United States with white folks and young people, young white folks there, you know, having hot dogs and sucking lollipops and other things, treating it as though it was a picnic. I wish that was the kind of technology that stayed out there, so we actually had tech supporting human rights as opposed to being a vehicle that goes the other way. What are high-tech firms? What can they do? I'm just going to briefly mention some things. Obviously, they can hire more minorities, women, and members of our marginalized group. Really important, they can train all employees on the historical and cultural basis for anti-Semitism, racial, gender, sexual orientation bias, what it means to have implicit bias, unconscious racism, what microaggressions are like. Obviously, high-tech companies, all companies involved in developing products that reach the public, like those pulse oximeters, can advance minorities, women, and members of marginalized groups to the highest levels of decision-making. There's also things that we can do as well, too. And I'm glad to be giving this presentation to a library audience, because libraries are a place where we can all learn to be more digitally literate. What do I mean by that? We can get our news sources from reputable places, not just because they pop up on a search screen, but because they have some validity behind them, and that we can have some confidence that they're not the source of fake news. Do you know that most people assume that the higher a search result appears on a search page, the more truth that it has? As it turns out, you can actually pay Google to get your result high up on a search page. And when I did the same search, when I entered the same terms that Dylan Roof entered, who assassinated 9 people in a South Carolina church, when I entered those same search terms, I got results very similar to those that Dylan Roof got. And the first 5 results that I got had nothing to do with the truth. They were actually Alex Jones from InfoWars, the Concerned Citizens, who are basically kind of a downtown reformed country club version of the Ku Klux Klan. And those results were paid for. Unfortunately, our young people and many of us who use technology think that if it's high up on a search page, it's got to be true. That, by the way, is the source of much fake news and of much conspiratorial theories as well. We can also look at the way we use social media platforms. I've long said to people that our unquestioned allegiance to Facebook, Twitter, and similar platforms simply puts more power in their hands. I didn't nominate or vote for Mark Zuckerberg to be the person who arbitrates democracy. And yet, Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms have become those very tools that arbitrate what the information is that we see, that become conduits for the manipulation of votes. And I didn't put them there. And to be honest, I really think that regulation of these large companies is not a bad idea. The other thing that all of us can do is we can begin to learn how to use technology in ways that help, for example, to make our presence online a little more anonymous. If you've ever wondered why, if you search for a product on Amazon and then you go to some other part of the web, maybe do a web search, your product search follows you, and a product that seems so related to what you've been interested in pops up, that's because somebody is tracking every place you go to online, is tracking your use of Amazon, and then bringing that over into your searches. So it might be nice to know that we can use a browser like Tor or a search engine like DuckDuckGo, really strange word, a name there, which makes your presence online a little bit more anonymous, so you don't get that following and that use of your data by these large companies. It's often said online that everything might be free to you, but really you are turning over to these large companies a gold mine of information that they couldn't even pay for, but you're giving it to them willingly by allowing them to track what you do online and what you purchase, and therefore giving them information about who you are, what your beliefs are, what your political beliefs are, and what you're willing to spend money on as well too. We can be more conscious about that. So what I would say, these are some of the discussion questions that in my one-on-one presentations or my in-person presentations, I suggest to those involved, how many results down on a search page do you look? Now, I've started doing things like going to the last page and working backwards instead of the first page and working forward. It gives you a really interesting way to look at search results. From what online sources do you get your news? You go to the New York Times website, or just figure whatever finally makes it to your Twitter feed is the news you want to consult. How many hours a day are you or your children or your grandchildren on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other social media platforms? Is that really necessary? Again, I think social media companies should be regulated. I think we're going to see that with this new administration. I think that's a good thing. How much do you know about alternative search engines and browsers and email platforms that actually protect your identity online. Now, I've said a lot of things. My book, Think Black, is just one book you can read. Think through the library or perhaps through Village Books. Some of you may even have some of these books. I'm not the only person to write about these important issues. There are a number of books that have come out recently, and here are some of the books that I think are probably some of the best in this area. And certainly, again, you'll have this presentation. Your librarians will be able to make these books available to you, either by consulting their own catalogs or this presentation when you have them. But I just want you, and I want all of us to be more informed citizens. And obviously, one way to do that is to read on some of these deep and very important issues that we've been discussing tonight. So my book, again, available through your local library, just came out in paperback about a month ago. So it's available in paperback through Village Books as well, too, which is really great. I've been really fortunate. The book has been awarded some very nice awards, including, I think what's most special for me is we were a 2020 finalist in nonfiction from the Hurston Wright Literary Foundation, when I also was awarded the 26th Hurston Wright Literary Award in fiction. So I kind of got both ends of that. Interestingly enough, Hurston Wright Foundation came to me and said, guys, you know, you got both of these awards, so now we want you to sit on our board evaluating all of the fiction entries. So I kind of got myself actually a job in which I actually had delivered to my house about a week ago 30 books that I have to read in the next 3 months. So interesting. Again, be careful what you're happy about. I'm going to say thank you so much for the opportunity to spend a few, an hour or so with you. If there are questions, I hope you have taken the time to drop them into the QA section of this Zoom presentation. I'm going to drop out of sharing mode and drop into a more live mode with you. And someone from the other side, from the library side of this presentation, might then have some questions that they want to pose to me based on you having written them in. So again, I want to say thank you for this opportunity to present this to you. And Katie, do we have any questions there?
We don't have any questions yet. So if you do have a question, please drop it in the Q&A feature. But I have a question just because I did really enjoy the book. Knowing all of this history and doing all of this research, what was the hardest part about writing this book, and what was maybe one of the funner parts of writing this book for you?
Sure. So the easiest part of writing the book was obviously that I'm writing a memoir. I'm telling the story through my dad. And that means I'm telling the story through somebody I live with for most of my life. So while certainly part of our relationship, as you'll see in the book, and as I'm sure you're aware of, was rocky at times, it was really easy and kind of fun to write that. I got a chance to talk with my sister and say, hey, Claudia, what do you remember about growing up? And so she could fill in the blanks. And we had a lot of fun where, sometimes she would have a completely different story for the same event that I did, because our mom might tell her something, my dad might tell me something, and that ended up with two different stories. The most difficult part was really trying to understand IBM and the history that it had in terms of social justice. I do realize that one question I did not answer is, why do I think IBM hired my dad in 1946? So let me take the time to answer that now, and let me do that by saying the following thing, Katie. Edwin Black really wrote the book, so to speak, a 600-page book on IBM and the Holocaust. Incredibly well documented. Hundreds of lawyers poured over it in different languages from different countries around the world. His book, IBM and the Holocaust, I know available through the library system. Anybody who wants can go back and read in detail IBM's involvement in that horrible chapter of our recent history. Edwin called me not long after Think Black came out, and it was a very interesting call because first I got an email and that said, if you want, enter this code and you'll get a text telling you what telephone number to call. So it's a very circuitous kind of, spy thriller kind of way. But eventually, after following the emails and the text messages and all of that stuff, I got to a telephone number where I made a call, and at the other end, I got a voice, kind of a gravelly voice that Edwin had, and he said, "Hi, this is Edwin Black." I said, "Well, hi, this is Clyde Ford." And he said, the first thing he said, didn't even say really hi. He said, "Why did Watson hire your dad?" And I said, "Edwin, I think IBM hired my dad. Watson hired my dad because they wanted to divert what they were really about." And the next thing he said, "Goddamn right they did." And so what I learned from Edwin, yeah, it really was funny. What I learned from Edwin, the piece that I didn't know, is about the same time IBM hired my father, they also hired 5 or 6 of the first Jewish software engineers as well, too. Systems engineers, IBM called them. What IBM did at the end of the war was IBM wanted to extract from German banks in American dollars the millions and millions of dollars they had made that were in Deutsche Marks at that point, which were in the currency of the Third Reich. There was a system to do that. Part of that system involved the Allies maintaining a reparations where the companies that took their money out of Nazi Germany would also be forced to pay a reparation to the individuals whose lives they had impacted. IBM didn't want to pay a penny to that reparations fund. They ended up not paying a penny to that reparations fund. And one of the ways they did that was by diverting attention away from what they were really doing to what became an incredibly interesting, apparently altruistic overture they were making. So, where is your attention going to be focused? Is it going to be focused on this kind of nebulous digital technology and its use in the Second World War? Or is it going to be focused on IBM saying, we just hired our first 2 African Americans, one in sales, one in software, and we just hired our first, a handful of Jewish Americans in software and sales? You're going to focus on that, and you're not going to focus on this other area where IBM is working really hard to get all of its millions of dollars out of Germany, and it did successfully. So I think the other thing there is IBM hired my dad because in 1946, people could understand how Ford Motor Company may have contributed to the Holocaust because it built trucks, and trucks are not that dissimilar from tanks. But
Sure.
very few people could understand how a cardboard, paper thin punch card with a hole there or not in a column had anything to do with the war effort, and therefore IBM flew under the radar of most people's awareness in terms of how that technology was used. I hate to say it, modern day technology flies under the radar of many people as well.
So while we were having that discussion, Clyde, I actually got 3 more questions. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. So actually somebody did ask, why did Watson hire your father? So we answered that one. That's great. And then Nadia Woodcock asks, thank you. Why did your dad get hired? What's the story behind that? So we've kind of discussed that. Let's see. And then Annette asks, given what IBM did in the Holocaust, what is your impression of the databases involved with current DNA services such as Ancestry.com and 23andMe?
Yes. So again, I think all technology like that has some need for regulation. I've used Ancestry.com's database or DNA testing, because I wanted to learn a little bit more about, my ancestry. It was great experience in that it helped me identify some aspects of my ancestry I didn't know about. But I am not at all opposed to regulating that technology, because I do think it can get out of hand. Just today, I was listening to a story, I believe it was on NPR, where the Chinese, very shortly after COVID hit, were attempting around the country to set up testing stations. And every time they would go to make a contract with a state or with an agency to set up that testing, part of it was that they would then capture and maintain the DNA evidence. And actually, there was a fellow on from one of the security agencies saying, we wanted to get to the States to help them understand that the Chinese were actually using this as a method of capturing the genetic information about Americans. Now, that information can be used lots of different ways. And so I do think it's really important to understand how our genetic information can be used both in a positive way, but also against us. And I am not at all opposed to having the companies and the technology used there regulated in a way that might help prevent the inappropriate use of that technology. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, well, I think especially now that DNA is being used to third cousins and such, that DNA is being used to find cold case suspects. It's an interesting line that we're getting there. Does anybody else have any questions? The Q&A is still open. And give it one more second. And if not, Clyde, thank you so much for doing 2 programs with us this year. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm going to remind everybody here on the call that we still really do want your input on our evaluations. So I'll put that back in the chat. And if you have any questions, or if you would like Clyde's slides, you can go ahead and email me. My email address I'll put in the chat as well is knbray@cob.org. And just real quick, Clyde, do you have anything else for us?
Well, Katie, I love working with the libraries. You're really a strong and important part of our community. I'm glad for all the support that you get. I look forward to the next time coming back to you and working with you again.